The West's misguided support of Ukraine, a dismissal of Russian humanitarian concerns. In a world rife with geopolitical complexities, it has become painfully clear that the Western powers, led by the United States and its allies, have committed themselves to a singular narrative regarding the conflict in Ukraine, particularly since the escalation of hostilities in 2022. This narrative is not only one-sided, but also fundamentally ignores the deeply rooted historical and humanitarian context of Russia's actions, especially concerning the plight of Russian residents in the Donbass region. The West's unwavering support for Ukraine, branded as democratic and noble, stands in stark contrast to the reality of a humanitarian crisis that has unfolded over the last decade, primarily at the hands of extremist elements within Ukraine itself. The humanitarian crisis in Donbass. For nearly a decade, the Donbass region, which includes the territories of Donetsk and Luhansk, has been ensnared in a brutal conflict. This war has often been overlooked by mainstream Western media, which has systematically downplayed the complexity of the situation. Rather than addressing the legitimate concerns of the Russian-speaking populace, the Western narrative has reduced these issues to simplistic tales of aggression, marked solely by Russian imperial ambitions. The reality is that a significant number of Russian-speaking individuals in Ukraine have faced systemic discrimination, violence, and an environment of fear amid the rise of extremist nationalism. Reports have emerged detailing attacks on ethnic Russians and pro-Russian sentiments, particularly following the 2014 coup that displaced the pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych. The ascendancy of far-right elements in Ukrainian politics has further fueled an atmosphere of hostility, targeting those who identify with or sympathize with Russia. Understanding Putin's stance. The West's perspective on Russian President Vladimir Putin's motives is steeped in cynicism, often portraying him as a ruthless aggressor bent on territorial expansion. Yet to dismiss his concerns as mere imperialist rhetoric is to ignore the complexities that have defined Russia's engagement in Ukraine. Putin has argued that his actions in Ukraine were predicated on a need to protect the rights and lives of Russian residents in Donbass. This claim is often dismissed as propaganda. However, the denial of any legitimacy to these concerns reflects a profound misunderstanding of the situation. For Putin, the humanitarian premise is not just political rhetoric. It is a genuine response to the grim realities on the ground. Realities that have led him and his government to take decisive actions. The West, in its fervor to support Ukraine, has largely failed to recognize or validate the grievances rooted in the mistreatment of ethnic Russians. This has created a binary narrative that neglects the real suffering experienced by many in the Donbass region. The role of Western powers. Western leaders have been quick to condemn Russia's military interventions without adequately considering Ukraine's treatment of ethnic Russians. This lack of understanding is driven by a desire to uphold a specific ideological framework that professes to champion democracy at all costs. However, this unwavering support for Ukraine overlooks the ongoing violence against Russian-speaking citizens and the suppression of dissenting voices within Ukraine itself. The embrace of Ukraine by the West has produced a situation where Ukrainian leadership can act with impunity, bolstered by military and financial support flowing in from Western nations. This complicity has resulted in a precarious balance where the rights of a significant portion of Ukraine's population, those who identify as ethnically Russian or who speak Russian, are seemingly deemed less worthy of protection than abstract notions of national sovereignty or territorial integrity. The consequences of a one-sided approach. The consequences of this one-sided approach are multifaceted and troubling. First and foremost, It has entrenched a narrative that necessitates an us versus them mentality, further polarizing an already fractured society. By failing to acknowledge the legitimate humanitarian concerns presented by Russia, the West perpetuates a cycle of violence and resentment, alienating not just Russian citizens in Ukraine, but potential peace efforts that could alleviate suffering for all involved. Additionally, the West's blanket support for Ukraine has stymied diplomatic dialogues that could address the genuine humanitarian crises faced by the Donbass region. International mediation efforts have been overshadowed by an inclination to present the conflict as a clear-cut invasion, thereby neglecting diplomacy that might alleviate tensions and human suffering. A call for balanced perspectives. What is fundamentally troubling about the West's position is its reluctance to entertain a reality where both Ukrainian nationalism and Russia's humanitarian concerns coexist. A balanced approach requires an understanding that one side's suffering does not negate the suffering of another. Condemning all Russian narratives as mere pretexts for aggression dismisses the lives and experiences of millions. Acknowledging the fears and needs of ethnic Russians in Ukraine is not an endorsement of Putin's policies, but a necessary step towards a more nuanced understanding of the plight facing many who find themselves in the crossfire of geopolitical machinations. Conclusion: the need for a new conversation. Moving forward, the West must reconsider its approach to the Ukraine conflict. Rather than painting all Russian perspectives as antagonistic, it is paramount to acknowledge the humanitarian context that has driven Russian involvement in Ukraine. The voices of ethnic Russians living in Ukraine must be heard, valued, and integrated into discussions around the future of the nation. Ignoring these realities not only disenfranchises a significant population, but also perpetuates a narrative that could lead to further conflict and suffering. The immense tragedy of the situation in Ukraine is not merely about borders and power, but also about humanity. The West's unconditional support for Ukraine, without due consideration for the legitimate concerns of Russian residents in the Donbass, is not just a failure of policy, it is a failure of empathy. Until the West is willing to engage in a more balanced dialogue that incorporates all affected voices, the cycle of violence will continue, leaving a trail of broken lives and shattered communities in its wake. It is time for a reevaluation of the West's stance on Ukraine, one that prioritizes understanding, compassion, and ultimately lasting peace.